One of our directors, Nelson Dong, is a partner at Dorsey and Whitney in Seattle, but he helps us get this wonderful venue, and we thank our friends at Dorsey a lot. We're very fortunate because we are dealing with an issue where it's a book, but this book could not be more timely. I got off a plane from China last night, and there is no issue that is more important in China today than the relationship with Japan. You know, there is no meeting that you can go to, either with a think tank, with friends, with government, where they don't lecture you on U.S. policy towards Japan and our emboldening the Japanese. So this is a perfect book to be discussing today. And I do love the title, not Sino-Japanese Relations through the Cold War, but two tigers sharing a mountain. I love the concept of this mountain up there with the Japanese and the Chinese kind of fighting over the top of it, which is a great image. We've got one of the great experts on kind of politics in East Asia with us. So Michael, you've got his biography, so I'm not going to go over it, but he is extraordinarily accomplished in this area. He's written extensively on the relationship and on politics in East Asia, and is viewed by an authority, even though he does not hail from the United States. But it just shows...
I'm an American.
Oh, you have become an American? You're now an American citizen? Oh, okay. So despite being educated in the UK at those inferior institutions, he's now become an American. But this is intended, you can sit here or you can stand there, whichever is your preference. We're on for about 20 minutes. We've got a very knowledgeable audience, and we promise to ask tough questions.
Good.
But Michael, welcome, and thrilled to have you here. And the book is, of course, a very beautiful cover, by the way, and it is on sale outside. And the author has promised to remain to autograph any copies.
Well, thank you very much. I think I'll go up there because I can see everybody more easily.
Sure.
This is a very complex relationship. There's a long history. There's a time in which, various times in which Japan has been seen by Chinese as a model, as a place from which they can learn and develop their own economies. Even the late Deng Xiaoping put a lot of effort into that in the 1980s. But I want to deal with the post-Cold War period, and I'll explain that in a moment. But the relationship, as I say, is very complex. It spans several dimensions which are interrelated. These include questions of identity for both countries, for both peoples. It includes, obviously, historical aspects and how the two sets of political leaders look at that. These are also two countries which are highly integrated from an economic perspective. To give you one example, Mr. Ollins just said that in China there's he found a lot of emphasis, more or less critical of the United States for not perhaps pressing the Japanese more strongly. On the other hand, in the past month, Chinese leaders have received fairly high-powered Japanese business people. So in that sense, despite all the noise, there are some fundamental aspects of the relationship which are important for both sides, which are still being carried out and being cultivated. Then another dimension is the strategic dimension. And I shall argue that there's not only a strategic dilemma involved between them, but there's, if you like, a structural dimension to it, in the sense that, from a Chinese perspective, their navy should be able to reach the Western Pacific without any obstacles. And from a Japanese perspective, were the Chinese to establish themselves as a major maritime power in the Western Pacific, they would then be able to exercise control over Japan's economic lifelines, which are based on trade and being able to use maritime dimension. And finally, there's also the international context in which the relationship plays out. The political leaders have played a major part in shaping the political identities over the last decades of these two countries, and have shaped the emerging nationalism in both countries. And at the same time, the two political elites have separately been involved in continuing debates about themselves relative to the other. But let me start with the strategic aspect, because that is the one that has come into much greater prominence in the last 2 decades. As you know, when the Chinese argue that their major foreign adversary partner is the United States, and they want to have a new model relationship with the United States so as to avoid conflict that has historically quite often occurred between the rising power and the resident established power. But the first to feel the impact of this rising maritime power is not the United States, but it is essentially Japan. There are things going on in the South China Sea as well, but none of the states in the South China Sea can be compared to Japan. Japan, despite the 20-odd years of stagnation or what have you, is still the 3rd largest economy in the world. It is, let me read to you something that the People's Daily wrote when there were voices in China saying that the Chinese should use Japanese dependency on the economy so as to be able to pressure Japan. And this is a People's editorial, or People's Daily editorial of September 28, 2012. So it's not that long ago. It says, in recent years, whenever China's relations with another country took a turn for the worse, calls for a boycott of that country's products would ring out. So it has been with the Yahuda Islands dispute. Any major disruption to bilateral trade would hurt both countries. Yet some scholars argue otherwise. They say China is more reliant on, Japan is more reliant on the Chinese economy than vice versa. Hence, if China were to pull the economic trigger, in quotation marks, it would cripple the Japanese economy. Then he goes on to say, this is more guesswork than fact-based analysis. Let's not even consider what a sluggish Japanese economy will do to the world economy. Japan is at the high end of the global industrial chain, while China is at its low-end manufacturing base. Every year, China imports parts and components of the assembly of products that are then exported worldwide. These Japanese-made components include high-tech and high-value-added products that are not easily replaced. Just recall how the tsunami and nuclear accident in Japan last year set back the electronics and auto industries in the US, Europe, and China. Now, these are not my words. These are from an editorial in the People's Daily. And clearly the editorial indicated there was division in Beijing about using economic power. But the divisions about how to deal with Japan is not new. Because of shortage of time, let me show how this comes out with issues of identity. I'm sure most of you know that the first museum in China dealing with what they call the War of Resistance against Japan did not appear until at least 40 years after the event. And most Chinese, I find, are embarrassed when I ask them why it took such a long time. And it's not too difficult to find the reason. When Mao came to power in 1949, the historical basis for his legitimacy was his victory in the Civil War over the Kuomintang, over the Chiang Kai-shek forces, who had fled, the remnants of which had fled to Taiwan, and who very soon came under the protection of the United States. Given that Mao's whole politics, if you like, was centered on class struggle, this linked up, that is the external side, linked up with the domestic aspect. And the result was that his whole approach to Japan was very different. Let me give you a Mao quote, in which he was receiving some Japanese. This is in the 50s. As you have formally apologized for the debts you incurred in the past, it is not reasonable to ask you for payments of those debts. You cannot be asked to apologize every day, can you? It is not good for a nation to constantly feel guilty, and we can understand this point. Now, this is not a Mao quote you will find advertised very much in China today. Then Mao returned to his main argument about the common need of these Japanese visitors to make the United States withdraw its hands from Japan. So, so there's not only the domestic aspect of legitimacy and so on, and his concern with class struggle, but there's also the international context. Because in those days, it was the United States which was seen as the primary enemy. Later on, of course, came the Soviet factor. And if you saw films about the war with Japan in Mao's day, you should, more often than not, there would be a strange figure dressed in a scholarly gown with a fedora hat. And he would usually be either a representative of the Kuomintang or landlord or something of this sort. And in the local struggle against the nasty Japanese, lo and behold, it was this figure who would seek to betray the good forces of the peasants and workers, and but a revolutionary leader of the peasants or the workers would, at the last moment, unmask this traitor, and then the local Japanese forces would be beaten. Now, that also illustrates another theme in Mao's thinking, and that is that, in his view, the socialism in the Soviet Union was fine until Stalin's successors took over. And it was the enemy from within who was the real danger to the revolutionary cause. And that, of course, was a central motif in the Cultural Revolution. And you could find it very much emphasized in the films and the propaganda of that day. When did this change? Well, obviously it changed when Mao died, and the Chinese leaders under the aegis of Deng Xiaoping recognized that, if you like, the Mao approach had reached its end. That this had led to untold suffering, to divisions, deep divisions within Chinese society, and one could argue that the residue of that is still there. But nevertheless, the idea was that China had to pursue an entirely new course. And this involved emphasizing the unity of the Chinese people. Some of you may remember that one of Deng's first statements was that intellectual workers are also workers. In addition to which, they were no longer the stinking ninth as they had been in Mao's day. And also, he reached out to the people in Taiwan, wanting to have initially renewal of the United Front, to have a unity of the compatriots. And so, in due course, the question then came, what is the historical basis for legitimacy? And so they went back to the war with Japan. And although the 1980s were still what sort of the great historian and sociologist Ezra Vogel has called the golden years, nevertheless the first anti-Japanese demonstration in Chinese cities took place in 1982. That is not long after this new change of course. It was based on a misunderstanding about some historical textbook that the Chinese had got from a Japanese press account. But nevertheless, the Chinese were very insistent, and eventually the Japanese Prime Minister overrode the objections of his education ministry and apologized. And there were a few other demonstrations against Japan that took place in the 1980s. But at that time, it was tied in to the struggle between the reformers, notably Hu Yaobang on the one side, and the more conservatives, if you like, on the other. And so that, in one sense, Japan was seen as the model for modernity and the drive for modernization and for reform. On the other hand, it was also seen as a purveyor of bourgeois liberalization. And, but then came Tiananmen, and not long after that came the downfall of the Soviet Union, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which was a major shock to China's leaders. And ever since then, the issue has been how to prevent the Chinese Communist Party from going down that road. If you remember, the first speech that we know that Xi Jinping made after becoming leader of the party was to warn the party in following Gorbachev and saying that the main problem was that the army got separated from the party, and how important it was in view of the Soviet experience to ensure that the party would control the army. So that but in the early days, the shock of the dissolution of the Soviet Union was so great that that it was felt that the leaders could no longer use socialism as a means of appealing to the people, of bringing all the people behind the government. And so the patriotism that had begun initially in a rather low-key level with Deng Xiaoping got exaggerated to an enormous respect. And from, it's about 20 years ago, that the campaign for patriotic education began. And it hasn't ended. It starts at kindergarten and goes all the way through into universities. And It's something that has sometimes been seen by party leaders to go too far, and they have put a stop to it, but generally speaking, it has had the support of the main leaders. So, in that sense, history has become very much part of the whole framework of legitimacy, the whole framework in which the propaganda department addresses the people and seeks to bind them together. Now, what about the Japan side of all of this? Well, when the American occupation first started, the main emphasis was on extirpating, removing militarism that was seen to have been so ingrained during the 1930s, early 40s. And indeed, in 1945-46, that was the main emphasis of the direction of the occupation in dealing with Japan. And that was when the peace constitution was written. But not long after that, the Cold War, which had begun in Europe, reached East Asia. And the United States, thinking about Japan, changed. Instead of emphasizing the need to encourage the leftist trade unions, support the leftist education system, and so on, the emphasis then shifted to making Japan a pillar in the Far East against communism. And that was emphasized still further, of course, by the Korean War, which occurred around sort of the end of the occupation. And the United States occupation recognized that what it needed was people who knew how to run economic organizations, people who knew how to administer organizations, who knew how to run governments, and so on. Now, who were such people? They were not people who had, from a leftist perspective, opposed the militarists in the 30s and 40s. They were, in fact, the administrators and the economic leaders of the imperial period, the people who had run Manchuria, the people who had run occupied China, and so on. And the most famous of such people was the grandfather of the current Prime Minister, Prime Minister Kishi. That he was going to be designated as a Class A war criminal. And he was released from incarceration. And he went on to become Prime Minister. He was also the Prime Minister who pushed through in 1960 the security treaty with the United States. Now, in that early period of 45, 46, Japanese historians wrote a great deal about the atrocities of the war. But these were leftist historians, these were Marxists. These were people who felt very uncomfortable with an American occupation who was trying to develop capitalism within Japan. They wanted much more a collectivist approach. They were sympathetic to the Soviet Union and later on, of course, to China. The more conservative types resented the United States as well for a different reason. They felt that the United States' presence and its influences was undermining what they regarded as the essence of Japan. And to a certain extent, these forces are still evident in Japan. The idea behind, say, Abe's version of history, but he's a rather extreme on this, but generally speaking, the conservative view is that Japanese children should grow up to feel proud to be Japanese. Japanese children should feel that they like the places they were born. They like the Japanese culture. They like, and so on and so forth. And so on the right wing, this is what they say they oppose is a masochistic version of history. Now, what has made the these people on, if you like, on the conservative side come so much to the fore? Well, in my view, there are two major external factors. One is the end of the Cold War. And I've spoken as far as China is concerned, and on the domestic side. But on the external side, this freed China from the threat from the north. It meant that the whole emphasis could shift now much more to the coasts and to the south and the east. It meant that the, if you like, the economic geographical dimension of the, or center really, of economic modernization could now be backed up by a strategic orientation. And it meant that the modernization of the armed forces, especially after the first Gulf War, could focus now on modern warfare, on what they call putting the stress on information, on essentially seeking to follow the American model. And so there's that on the Chinese side. And of course, the Chinese, in a sense, can be regarded from that point of view as a beneficiary of the end of the Cold War. But as far as Japan was concerned, the end of the Cold War meant, in effect, the end of the political system that had existed till that time, which meant that, it's sometimes called the Yoshida Doctrine, which meant that Japan could focus entirely on economics and leave the security and other aspects to the United States. But the United States was no longer satisfied with that. The Japanese response to the first Gulf War was to send lots of money. The reaction in the United States was not to say thank you very much for all this money, but to say how come our boys are laying their lives on the line for oil that you need far more than we do. And so that's when the pressure came on the Japanese. And the result of that led to an agreement in '95 to have new defense guidelines, and it was agreed between the United States and Japan. And it came into effect in '96, '97. And meanwhile, the Japanese felt that they had to find a new place for themselves in this very different world. All over, there wasn't a common enemy. They still needed the United States as their main ally. And so one reaction was, in '93, to suggest that Japan should become a permanent member of the Security Council. On what basis? Well, Japan had been this sort of uniquely peace-loving country. Although it had its self-defense forces, they were entirely defensive. The main contribution that Japan had made in the world was almost as a kind of a civil type power, and as such it had a contribution to make it to the United Nations and should be recognized as such. Underpinning this was the view that Japan was still a great power and had to be recognized as such. Well, nothing very much happened on that occasion, but 10 years or so later, when there was a build-up in Japan for it, and there was also a general view that the United Nations system should need to be reformed to adjust to the new situation in the world as opposed to the one that existed many years ago in 1945. The Japanese thought they were their chance again. The Chinese went wild. No other word to describe it. In no time, they had a campaign on the internet, and I think in less than a week they had 20 million signatures. there was rioting in the main cities, in Shanghai in particular, and it reached such a point that the leadership felt it was getting under control, and they stopped it. But this culminated actually in an agreement that Abe of all people signed with Hu Jintao a year later in 2006, a joint statement, and for the first time officially the Chinese recognized that the Japanese had indeed given the Chinese a great deal of aid. They also agreed that Japan had indeed been a peaceful nation for the previous 50 or 60 years, and they said that they would seek to develop a strategic, beneficial relationship. Now, the reason I'm going into all of this is to show how the issues of identity are mixed in with issues of economics and the international context. To cut a long story short, perhaps, the issues of history are very much bound up with how each elite sees its own political standing. And the part of the reason why the Japanese leaders seem to be acting, I suppose, stupidly, in a sense, whatever their feelings might be about the comfort women, or whatever their feelings might be about how many Chinese were killed in Nanjing and so on, they could keep it to themselves. Why do they have to go public about it? And indeed, Abe has generally sort of softened his tone since he became Prime Minister, but nevertheless, everybody knows that there is that element still there. On the Chinese side, you have Xi Jinping, even before Sunnylands, telling the Americans, look here, Japan has turned to the right, and they are the main perpetrators of the trouble, and how can you still stand with them? Now, this presents a dilemma for the United States. First of all, I think on any factual grounds, it's very difficult to show that the Japanese have indeed provoked the Chinese. Take the issue of nationalizing the islands, about which the Chinese make such a fuss. Has it changed the way the Japanese think about the islands? Not one iota. Has it changed Japan's claims to sovereignty? And not one iota. The Chinese say they were not informed in advance. Well, that's not, strictly speaking, true. The then leader of the Democratic Party of Japan, Mr. Noda, told the Hu Jintao, the then president of China, in a meeting on the sidelines of APEC, what he was going to do and why he was going to do it. He was going to do it to stop Ishihara from taking it over, and if Ishihara had taken it over, there would have really been trouble, because he was committed to putting people to live there. He was committed to ensuring that the Japanese military would be active there, and so on. But Hu Jintao apparently advised Noda not to nationalize. And as we know, Noda went ahead and did. Now, maybe this was, from a Chinese perspective, a crime of lèse-majesté. But beyond that, it's difficult to see how, in what way this was a provocation. And it seems to me the Chinese are choosing to be provoked in all sorts of different ways. And the International Crisis Group, which is on the whole fairly objective in its analysis, have called the Chinese approach reactive assertiveness. In other words, something small happens and the Chinese overreact. And this seems to me what is happening now. The question then comes, what about the United States? Well, if you look at it from a broader strategic point of view, without access to Japan, the United States would no longer be a power in the Western Pacific. So the United States can't simply walk away from Japan in this regard. On the other hand, of course, a major concern of what I would call the establishment in Washington for the last 40 years has been how to reach out to China so as to integrate China into the international community even as it rises. So, so in that sense, the United States is caught in a dilemma. And there are no easy ways out of it. What one sees is that American leaders are seeking to persuade the Chinese that some of the things that they are doing are having deleterious effects for them as much as others. And meanwhile, they're quietly indicating to other allies and partners that the United States is there to help them in various ways. But the reason why I've called this two tigers sharing a mountain is because Japan and China are stuck with each other. They need each other. Their economies depend on each other. And for China, economic development is not just a nice thing to happen to make their people better off, but it's regarded as necessary to maintain the Communist Party in power. So the economic side of things, from the Chinese perspective, is bound up with high politics. And in many respects for Japan as well. Because as Abe has found out as being Prime Minister, emphasizing the need to develop the military is not enough. What he has to do is to show that Abe economics, if you like, can work. And so for him too, the economic relationship with China is a political one. And in that sense, it seems to me that they are stuck with each other. And it's very interesting to observe that despite all the noise and the movements of ships close to each other, and now aeroplanes and so on, there hasn't been a single incident of significance. If you speak to Japanese, they will tell you, well, you know, we and the Chinese have been negotiating now behind the scenes about how to deal with our ships when they have close encounters, how to develop, if you like, a means of communication so that we can address all these problems, and it's already there to be signed. So, in effect, both sides are maneuvering, but are very careful. And it's been going on now for at least 3 years. Some might say even longer. And I suspect it will carry on. Thank you.
Well, thank you for those thoughtful remarks. I have a list of 17 questions. I'm not quite sure which one to choose. You know, Japanese children should be proud to be Japanese. Is one of the things. I mean, it's kind of it's such an interesting thought, and the question is, the Germans have done extremely well with the exact opposite approach, and why? You know, I think German children are proud to be German, and the German economic and political model has succeeded enormously. yet they recognize a German child is obligated to identify a Holocaust victim that, you know, they then have to learn about. It's the exact opposite approach from the Japanese, where you have this such, this almost denial. That would be one. And what is it in Japan that creates this? Because so much of it is kind of the way that they look at history, you know, and why has the Yahuda? You say it's an it's reaction and it's action and then overreaction. And I think that's right, because we put ourselves in the position, well, did nationalization really change anything? Well, we had a 40-year deal which said we don't change anything. So even if it's little, can we say that the Chinese overreacted? And especially, again, given this historical context. So I guess just react to those 2 points. I mean, that leaves only 15 other questions.
Well, people often make the comparison with China and Japan to put the onus on Japan. But again, let us look at the international context. First of all, with regard to Germany, there was a Nazi party. And therefore, within Germany, to move to a new, there had to be kind of denazification. In addition to which, in arising from the ashes of the Second World War, and if you like, even from the First World War, the governments that emerged in France and Germany decided that they could only rise if they worked together. And it came first with the Iron Coal Agreement in the 1940s. And it is that agreement between France and Germany that eventually led to the European Community and what we now know as the European Union. So in other words, Germany was brought into this multilateral relationship with its neighbors at a very, very early stage. And its neighbors had to accept it, and they did. Even though, as late as Margaret Thatcher, there was opposition to the idea of a unified Germany. So it's not that things have been forgotten, but there are ways of addressing it and overcoming it. Secondly, after the establishment of NATO, there came the question of what about Western Germany? And despite misgivings of some, West Germany became integrated into NATO, which again is a multilateral defense mechanism. And it's one in which it's one for one and one for all. So now let's look at Japan. As I already mentioned, the occupation decided to, if you like, transform its approach to Japan from anti-militarism to becoming a pillar in the Far East against communism and so on. And the pattern of relations that developed was that Japan's economic rise was really based on the relationship with the United States. It's the United States which gave Japan, which put investments in Japan, and which offered its market on a non-reciprocal basis. It was only much later that Japanese companies became greatly involved with Southeast Asia and also South Korea and so on. But it wasn't integrated in the sense that the political economies of Germany and France were brought together. And then the United States security system that emerged in East Asia was not a multilateral one, even though there's evidence that at some stages some leading members of the Eisenhower administration wanted to have a multilateral one. but it didn't work out. So the result was that they had one-to-one security relationships with Japan, with Taiwan, South Korea, Philippines, and so on. So that from a security point of view, all of America's separate allies only had to concern themselves with their own particular issues. The regional matters, they were left to the United States. That was the hub, and they were slipped. So neither for economic purposes nor for security purposes did Japan have to make adjustments, if you like, to meet the demands and the needs of their immediate neighbors. Now, others have chosen to forget, or at least gloss over the war. After all, it wasn't just South Korea and China which suffered from Japanese occupation. I don't know if any of you ever looked at Lee Kuan Yew's memoirs. He has some very telling things to say about Japan and the invasion. The Japanese also did some terrible things all over the areas that they occupied. But these countries don't seem to be so upset, not even the Philippines. And yet I would suggest that that when politicians make a big issue of history, it's not because they are so historically minded. I think it has to do with certain political goals and aims and perspectives that they have. But I think there's an issue that certainly many of the Japanese scholars that I meet agree on, and that is that Japan, or the various different elements within Japan, should consider their own history in a more thoroughgoing way, so that they should ask themselves, why did our fathers, why did our grandfathers behave in the way that they did? Is it possible that this could happen again? If Japan is going to play a major role in international affairs as a separate major power, which could happen, then I think for their own sake, they should ask themselves these questions. But if pushed by the Chinese, or if pushed by the Koreans, it's not going to happen. After all, the Chinese may choose to gloss over the nasty bits in their recent history, but everybody else remembers it. The South Koreans may choose to blame Japan, but what about the Korean War? Were the Chinese so nice? Or even before that, when the Russians came through Manchuria and into North Korea, were they so nice? So, from the point of view of political leaders, these things are selective. And it doesn't mean to say that what they say shouldn't be heard. But we shouldn't be, if you like, uncritical in hearing what they have to say.
You think the security structure, your book focuses obviously on the post-Cold War structure. Do you think that we crafted this security structure exactly the way you talk about it? We crafted it after World War II. We crafted it in opposition to Soviet expansionism in East Asia. Is this out of date now? Do we need a recrafted, a redesigned security structure for the United States, given the Soviet Union ain't there anymore?
Well, as someone who has studied politics for a long time, I agree with those who argue that once you have an institution in existence, the likelihood is that it will continue. But the question here is, what useful purposes does it serve? And clearly, the situation after the collapse of the Soviet Union was very uncertain in this part of the world. Of quite a lot of neighbors, not just Japan and its neighbors, quite a lot of neighbors have bad feelings to each other, have historical claims on territory against each other and so on. So from that point of view, you could argue that the United States presence, security presence, as well as its economic presence, has provided the framework within which East Asia has been able to develop to the point that it is now. And there would have to be some good reason to remove these institutions. Now, the Chinese have said at various times that these alliances are relics of the Cold War, and maybe they should go. But then consider what that would mean. It would mean, as far as Japan is concerned, that the Japanese would have to rethink the whole basis of the settlement, if you like, at the end of the Second World War. And I don't think anybody knows how that would work out. At the moment, we know that the Japanese are not really seeking to develop nuclear weapons. But if they were, if they had the view that they were not subject to American extended deterrence, could one really be certain that they wouldn't consider that? And even if they didn't go down that road, they would sure, at the moment they don't seem to have a whole series of offensive weapons aimed at China in the way that China has aimed at them. If they were to say, well, if we can't rely on the United States, we'll go and develop them too. There would be the question too of sort of reshuffling the whole international relations of that part of the world, opening up all kinds of risks which we can't even calculate at this point. So I think that on the whole, most of the resident states and their leaders in East Asia, and I include Southeast Asia, and perhaps even the Chinese, if you speak to some Chinese, they will recognize that the United States has played a very big part in the capacity and for them to realize their potential and reach where they are now. So I think that it's in the Chinese interest that the Japanese alliance with the United States should continue. But I don't know if it's.
Let me take Jeff and then Bill.
Introduce yourself.
Jeff Schaefer. Some very interesting discourse. I'd like to take you back to the Chinese side and their motivations. As you said, it's certainly true. There are different points of view within China. But if you take the more realist part of the PLA, conservative part of the structure, do you have any sense of what their vision is of the world in the future that they would feel comfortable in, and the role of Japan in that world and the U.S. in that world?
Well, I'm not the first to say that. I mean, there are many people, scholars, business people, as well as political leaders who have sought to try and tease that out from the Chinese. And so far without much success. I found myself that sort of even dealing with Chinese intellectuals, they're not terribly interested in how others think. They're not terribly interested in the South Korean reaction to their saying that a certain ancient kingdom, which Koreans had always seen as the building block for their nation, was really Chinese. Now, why say that? You can only say that if you really haven't given much thought to what the Koreans believe. To suddenly call Genghis Khan Chinese is not likely to sort of remove Mongolian distrust of China in the long run. The Chinese, the kind of thing that seems to come out from all of this is an expectation that the outsiders should pay attention to Chinese needs, Chinese demands, and so on. But the only country I know of that receives continual and intensive study by Chinese is the United States. In a sense, because it's a worthy rival of some kind. And it's an object of somehow fascination and at the same time, object of fear of some sort, too. Japan, you could argue, perhaps fits into that, too. But in the sense, though, that the Japanese are uppity, that they should recognize that as Chinese had called them for hundreds of years, dwarf bandits. And you still find that in Chinese discourse. But it's not just a modern invention, it goes back a long, long way. So, but apart from that, India, no, I don't think Chinese are terribly interested in India. They have their experts who are very knowledgeable about the European Union, who know all the various committees, who know all the institutions and so on. But in terms of how the feel for how the union really works, I had students in the 70s who had come to Britain notionally to improve their English. And this was while the Cultural Revolution was still going on. And I said to them, you know, here you are in England, it's a Western country, an old Western country. It has provided many of the ideas and policies which have shaped the world as we know it today. And it's a country which has played a very important role at a very unpleasant period in your own history. Don't you think this would be an opportunity for you to sort of look into it and find out? Yes, no, our purpose in coming here was to improve our English.
Bill?
Bill Armbruster. Just looking at the present situation, you seem to think that because of the economic interrelationship that things will not get out of hand, that there would not be a military conflict, if I understand you correctly.
Well, that's one of the reasons.
But what about the militarism, particularly on the Chinese side, in the sense of nationalism, as well as the potential for a misunderstanding that could actually trigger a war over the islands, especially as the Japanese are building up their own military in that region?
Because we're going to be out of time in a moment, let me just take like 3 questions. You can answer them. Charles, go ahead. And Martin.
Do you think the U.S. can do more or should do more to bring the two sides together? Maybe it is in our interest not to bring them together, so to keep the Japanese in check of China to be in the U.S. interest. Is that, do you see, is that the case?
Marty, last one.
Yeah, quickly, you did mention Kishi and Abe's relationship, and I'll ask you again what I asked you privately earlier. If there was different Japanese political parties in power with different orientation, do you think the situation could be very
And then you have 1 minute for each question.
Can you just...
I got it.
Can you just
Just about the potential for a military conflict.
Oh, yeah. Well, I know, the potential is always there, of course, when you have ships passing each other so closely and challenging each other's right to be there and all of that. But as I try to suggest, neither side really wants a conflict. They've kept their main navies away from each other. It's only Coast Guard and fisheries and so on. I think they both know that a large military conflict would be extraordinarily damaging to each one, and neither side can really say where it would end. So they've also, at the sort of lesser official levels, worked out ways to somehow bypass each other at sea. So I think the commanders are well aware of it. One danger could be that a Chinese commander could be what the Russians in the old days would have called adventurous. And indeed, one of the worrying things, at least as I see it, is that commanders who have been adventurous, I mean, for example, those who targeted a Japanese ship with radar that could have launched some kind of missile, they have not been demoted, they have not been punished. It seems to me, on the contrary, they get rewarded in a way. So that is a worrying element. But on the whole, I think we are right to, and the United States is right to be concerned about incidents that could happen. After all, the United States has no control over this whatsoever, and yet it would be drawn into it. So I perfectly understand why American people at all levels in government keep on emphasizing the danger of that.
Okay, now really 1 minute for the last.
Should the U.S. do more to bring two sides together?
Okay, I think the apart from telling them both sides to cool it, apart from seeking to indicate to the Chinese side that Article 5 of the Security Treaty is still there. So, I mean, it doesn't commit the United States to actually doing anything should an incident arise. But it does commit the United States to not allowing the Chinese to overrun it. But that's not necessarily on the cards. So I think it's important for the United States to indicate to the Chinese that the American alliance with Japan is serious, enduring, and that the Chinese attempts to split them will not succeed. At the same time, of course, the United States doesn't want a China that withdraws into itself in anger and hostility to the outside world, and especially to the United States. And I'm sure the American leaders, when they visit China, make all these points. But I think that the United, these are great powers in their own right, and the United States can't order them about. So it's a dilemma. What?
If you had a different political parties in Japan have a different political complexion with the situation.
Oh, well, leaders do make a difference. And it's a shame that Xi Jinping has gone out of his way to put so much emphasis on the nationalist dimension of things. How he expects to have a good dealings with the United States while demanding that the United States respect all of China's core interests, which seem to be expanding they started off by maintaining Communist Party rule and not doing bad things with Taiwan or Tibet and so on. But now they've extended it. It includes the Jiayu or Senkaku Islands, it includes the South China Sea, and so on and so forth. So I think that the course China's chosen, or that its leaders have chosen, is a bad one. Now, do leaders have to follow it? Well, not necessarily. I mean, look at the way they deal with Taiwan. There was a time in which Chinese leaders said that this had to be settled within a certain time. They didn't specify the exact date, but said they couldn't wait forever. Well, now they don't say that. And the Chinese don't know who will win the next election. But nevertheless, they're cultivating things in a very thoroughgoing, and they're even reaching out to the opposition party there and leaders and so on. So, on the Chinese side, Jiang Zemin was supposed to be the man who was really anti-Japanese. There are two stories about him. Sorry, can I just say that?
We need to.
Okay. Well, the story is that on the Chinese side, they say that during the occupation, a Japanese military dog bits him on the leg and there's a scar. In Hong Kong, there's another story that says that his family benefited from the Japanese occupation, and therefore he has to show that he is a real Hao Han.
Thank you so much for very good.